the tomatoes are growing. They're looking really fabulous. Look, it's almost as tall as me. And I'm not that short. I'm kind of short, but not that short. 5'5", reasonable. So, one thing that we need to be doing right now, and is probably the most important thing that you need to be watching for with your tomatoes, is watching for disease. So, fortunately, it's funny because I was just tending to all of these tomatoes just the other day, but fortunately for you, not necessarily fortunately for my tomatoes, we have evidence of some disease right here. So you can see this leaf is starting to look kind of wilty, it's kind of sick, it's just generally not looking happy, whereas the rest of the plant is looking good. Like we might see this sort of wilt going on if the whole plant didn't have enough water or something like that, but I'm definitely seeing disease on this specific leaf, and this looks like some sort of fungal nastiness. I'm not quite sure what. I think it's early blight, not totally positive, but to me this is like a clear example of some disease going on. And so I don't worry about identifying exactly what disease it is. What I do is I immediately pull off that leaf, and I try to pull it off in such a way that I am not touching any other leaves or any other parts of the tomatoes. So this, as you can see, looks kind of sick. It's not what we want. We are going to, or I am going to take it and I'm going to put it in the forest. And that is another thing about what you need to be doing when working with tomatoes this time of year. You only want to be touching these plants when they are dry, because if they are wet, any sort of disease, whether it's fungal or bacterial or whatever, is going to spread much more quickly than if the plants are dry. So make sure that everything is dry. And then if you touch anything that looks diseased, you need to wash your hands. And you should wash your hands anyway with soap and water before coming and working with your tomatoes, especially if you happen to smoke tobacco, because tobacco carries tobacco mosaic virus. The virus can live in dead plant tissue for up to 2 years. It's so crazy. And so you want to have total cleanliness when you come to work with your tomatoes, and also whenever you touch anything that's diseased. And I like to go and wash my hands between working on different tomato beds, just to make sure that I'm not spreading things from one bed to another. So this is your lesson on safe tomato handling. I was going for some sort of joke there, but it didn't really work out. But if you use your imagination, I'm sure you can figure it out. This is evidence, I believe, of late blight. And so anytime that you see tomato leaves that have yellow spots on them, you want to pull off the entire leaf. So this entire thing is one leaf. And this is not quite as concerning as what we saw before, as far as cleanliness and whatever that word is, something. But we do want to get this out of the garden. So we saw two situations where just one leaf was affected on the plant, in which case we can just get rid of the plant. But in this situation, I'm seeing some very odd growth. This particular tomato. I'm not exactly sure what's going on. I think it looks fungal to me. It might be viral. I have 49 tomato plants growing, and so in order to keep my other 49 tomato plants super healthy, I am going to pull up this whole plant and destroy the whole plant. This is not a choice you might make if you're just growing one tomato, but if you have a bunch of tomatoes and you have a plant where the entire plant looks sick, then it's worth it to just take it out and not try to go any further with questions of like what's going on with it. So I'm going to go ahead and remove it from the trellis. And if it's viral, it's actually like the pole itself could even be infected with virus. And these definitely. So we're going to take those with us. That's okay. Okay, so sad days, I know. There's so many people who have such a hard time killing their plants because it's really sad. But this one plant could infect all of my other 48 plants. So I'm going to take this plant and I am going to destroy it. As you can see, there's a lot of times when there's strange things going on with tomatoes. Like I've said, all sorts of viruses and funguses that want your tomatoes. And luckily, as we talked about last month, there's no reason to not remove foliage from your tomatoes. The tomatoes are making way more foliage than it makes sense to have when growing in a temperate climate. And so we want to be removing foliage, one, if there's any disease going on, and you can remove the foliage first and ask what the disease was second. Like, it's just great to remove foliage. And then second, we want to remove foliage just to create a more airy atmosphere so that there's more airflow, so that there's less fungal problems. So when in doubt, take out the leaf. If you have, maybe more than 3 or 4 plants planted, if the entire plant is looking sick and it's not just that it's dry and hasn't been watered, then go ahead and pull out the whole plant, because you do not want to have plants that have fungal and viral problems infecting your other plants. This is a really neat trick that I learned from my neighbor. And so copper is actually some form of liquid copper, is what's sprayed normally on commercial tomato plants in order to keep down funguses. And so this is a cool little trick, because the copper will accumulate in the soil, and it's really not a very good thing. But this little trick of sticking a copper wire through the main stem of the tomato plant, apparently keeps fungal diseases from being a major problem. And I saw evidence in my neighbor's garden of this working last year. So we'll see how it works here. And the jury is still out, but it doesn't seem to be hurting anything. So pretty cool. One other thing to really watch out for this time of year is blossom end rot. And so what blossom end rot is the blossom end, which means the part that's away from the plant of each tomato, can start to get rotten. And that is such a bummer. Like, you have these beautiful tomatoes starting to grow, and then they develop a black spot at the end of the tomato, and then that tomato is no good. And that is such a bummer. And it happens because of a calcium deficiency within the tomatoes. So what has a lot of calcium? Milk. So apparently you can fertilize your tomatoes with milk. You can also spray them with whey. What I've done before is just use bone meal for side dressing on the ground, and that seems to work too. So any of those solutions sound awesome. We've talked a lot about funguses, bacteria, like problems that can happen on like a microscopic level that affect the macroscopic. And we've also talked about deficiencies. If your whole tomato plant is starting to get just a little bit of a yellow tinge, it probably needs nitrogen, by the way. And we've talked about all these things, but now we're going to talk about pests. So I have had very little problems with tomato hornworms. I've had a little bit of issues. They are the coolest looking, crazy caterpillar, like really, really crazy. Like they look like something that would come out of Alice in Wonderland. And they have a horn, and hence tomato hornworm. And like I said, I haven't had a lot of problems with them, but I was talking with my parents, and they used to have like quite the nice little garden. And my mom said that one tomato hornworm, when they were growing a big garden in Idaho, would strip an entire tomato plant of all of its leaves in one day. So whether that might be a little exaggerated or not, you can be the judge, but just watch out for the tomato hornworms. And if you're noticing defoliation, if you're noticing the leaves being stripped from the tomato plant, look around and just Google what a tomato hornworm looks like, and you will be amazed at how cool of a creature they are. And you might feel a little bit of sadness about having to kill it. You could always transplant it. You could take it to the forest, but I guess then it would die because it wouldn't have any tomatoes to eat. But whatever the case is, watch out for them. So we covered some pruning in last month's videos and did a pretty good job. So if you want the full pruning picture, make sure to refer to last month's videos. This will just be a little review. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the very end of the longest trunk of the tomato. So this is, I've been pruning this pretty well, so I only really have one trunk. And I'm coming to the very end of it. And at the very end, I see here a growing tip. There's all these little leaves that are all bundled up and getting ready to grow and unfurl and make more leaves and more stems. So I'm looking in there and I notice that that is my primary terminal growing tip. And so I do not want to pick that off. Whatever you do not remove this, because if you remove this, then the tomato will not grow or will not grow properly. So leave that. Then I'm going to work my way down and I'm looking at the base of each leaf to see if I have a secondary growing tip, or also known as a sucker, coming out from the armpit of where the main trunk and the leaf meet. So right here, there is no sucker. Then I work my way down right here. This little leaf is the beginning of a sucker. So I'm going to pull it out. I probably should have put that in my pocket or something. This is a flower. Do not remove the flower. We did remove the flowers that were within a foot or a foot and a half of the ground. But at this point, way up here, we're like, I don't know, 4 feet in the air. This is going to become fruit. Fruit comes from flowers. So do not remove the flowers. Work my way down. This one has already been removed, it looks like. Typically, there's almost always a sucker growing at the armpit. And then I work my way down again. And oh, lo and behold, look at this sucker. So I'm going to pinch off that sucker. You might choose to use pruners. And I'm going to get rid of it. This is another tomato plant. So this is a determinate variety versus the indeterminate variety that we were working with before. So with this particular plant, you know, I still just have one major trunk, and there's one sucker. Oh, I guess 2 suckers that I'm going to prune. So I was looking at this as my growing tip, and I take off 2 suckers. If you have not been pruning your tomato plant properly, you are likely to have multiple trunks going on. And when the tomato is still this size, I think it's a really good thing to go ahead and get rid of those trunks, because you really just want to maintain airflow on the whole tomato. So I was just talking with the videographer, like I am so dorky about pruning tomatoes. I love pruning tomatoes, and so I'm maybe the only one on the street who only has 1 trunk per tomato. But yeah, I think it's best to just have 1 trunk. And I'm sorry that I don't have a demo for you of what it looks like to have more than 1 trunk. And then when I'm pruning, the first thing that I do is I prune any suckers that might exist, large or small. Don't be afraid. Like, tomatoes like to be pruned. They are from a tropical environment where having tons of vegetative growth makes sense, but we want to focus the tomatoes' energy on making fruit, not on making green growth. So pruning them is super helpful. So then the next reason why we want to prune is we're going to remove leaves for disease. Or anything touching the ground. Here I see a leaf that is very close to touching the ground. So I'm going to remove that. And then this leaf is looking kind of close to touching the ground. So I'm going to also remove that. Oh, this leaf has multiple issues. So one is the very tip of it is trying to touch the ground. The other is that it is going and getting up in the space of other tomato plants. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that to increase airflow in my tomato patch. And then I'm looking at this leaf is looking pretty healthy and it's getting plenty of airflow around it. I'm going to leave it. This leaf is kind of getting up on the space of this leaf, so I'm going to go ahead and prune that off. And I could take this leaf off or I could leave it. I'm probably just gonna leave it. So as you can see, like I'm removing a lot of leaves, a lot of foliage, and that is totally fine. And I will continue to remove these leaves and foliage as the plant continues to grow up. And it's just generally, if you live in a moist environment, really good practice to go ahead and prune.